Well, I want to welcome everyone to our first History and Forms of Lyric lecture for this academic year. It's a convention to say that it's a pleasure to introduce someone, but it actually really is a pleasure for me to introduce Roland Greene, whose work I'm extremely fond of and have been following these many years. But I do have to make a few jokes, at least one. Which is, this is also a very grand event, because it's not often that I get to introduce a president. Roland is the president of the Modern Language Association, but also he is not only a named professor at Stanford, but he is the Mark Pigott KBE Professor. Now, I did not know what KBE stood for. I actually had to email Roland and ask him, and it turns out it's quite wonderful. He is the Mark Pigott Knight Commander of the British Empire Professor. So not only am I introducing a president, but a Knight Commander. So be on good behavior, right? So now I'll get back to serious business. Roland got his PhD at Princeton in '85, and then was an assistant professor and associate professor at Harvard from 1984 to '92, and then moved to the University of Oregon, where he was for about 8 years, and then in 2001 moved to Stanford, where he still is, and has attained the remarkable eminence that I've already mentioned. To give you some sense of his range, I'll get to talking about his articles in a minute, because I think people's articles often give you more sense of their range than is possible with books. Just before we get to that, he has a number of really remarkable positions other than being president of MLA. He's the editor-in-chief of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. So one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to have him here is that not only is he a great lover and scholar of Renaissance poetry, but he really is a poetics person, and is therefore absolutely perfect for this series. And his position as the editor of that remarkable, very fat volume testifies to this interest. He's also an editor of a series, gives you some sense of his range, called World Literature Reimagined, which has published a number of volumes already on including Galician cultural studies, Turkish literature, and Brazilian narrative traditions. So it gives you some sense of the kind of thing he can supervise from a sort of global perspective. He's also the director or founder of a digital electronic portal called the Arcade, which is a digital salon. So anyhow, I'm sure Roland would be glad to talk to you about this afterwards. It's quite intriguing. His articles really show the range of his interests. So let me give you just some titles. Not Works, but Networks, Colonial Worlds in Comparative Literature. And one of the things that Roland is interested in is what it means to do comparative poetics. So another title is Between English and Other Literatures, an Agenda for Working Together, New World Studies and the Limits of National Literatures. So that gives you some sense of it. One of the things that I find especially wonderful about Roland's work is he's managed to put together two things which seem to be incompatible, namely focus and breadth. And and I'll talk a little more about this, but one way of seeing that is that he's really interested in something which couldn't be closer to my heart, namely close reading. What do we do with close reading in our world of literary studies and a world of comparative studies? He has some quite wonderful things to say about this. And let me read you the end of an essay he wrote about the Renaissance critic Harry Berger, who himself is a wonderful kind of close reader. He said, this essay ends, Berger's example, you do call him Berger rather than Harry. Everybody else in the book calls him Harry. Berger's example shows us that reconstructing is always the most productive engagement we can have with any model. that one critical generation's blindness or obstacle ought to be the starting point of the next, and that the negotiation with close reading is never finished, but always getting underway. And I must say, I truly love that. I won't go over honors and achievements. There are too many. I was pleased and intrigued to see that his CV includes a list of dissertation students he's worked with, which is, I must say, quite an amazingly long list. You might have even more than I have, which is quite extraordinary since I'm older than you are. He is currently working on 2 books, one called Being Baroque, a term that he is determined to revive for us from its scholarly tomb, and a work on 2 20th century Latin American poets, which should give you some sense of his range. So now let me talk a little bit about his 3 books. The first is called Post-Petrarchism, Origins and Innovations of the Western Lyric Sequence. And it's interesting to me that he is willing to use the definite article, the Western Lyric Sequence. He's unfashionable enough to believe there really is such a thing as the Western Lyric Sequence. That book is intriguing because it starts off as if it's going to be just an ordinary book of Renaissance literary criticism. So there's a chapter on Petrarch, not surprisingly, and a chapter on Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. And then it sort of divagates a little bit to Edward Taylor's preparatory meditations, but, we've crossed the ocean, but we're still in the land of essentially Renaissance poetics. But then suddenly Whitman's Leaves of Grass appears in that same chapter. And then in the next chapter, we're in sequences by Yeats. And then in the final chapter, we've moved out of the English-speaking world and are discussing Pablo Neruda and Martin Adon. So this just, even in his first book, you can see that someone who is extremely well-trained as a Renaissance scholar is suddenly moving forward, willing to think about 19th and 20th century poetry, and moving out from the English-speaking world. The second book, Unrequited Conquests, Love and Empire in the Colonial Americas, shows him moving entirely over to the world of Latin American work, although of course with the awareness of everything he knows about European literature. My favorite, well, I won't read you all my favorite sentences, but my favorite chapter, to which I would urge you, is a chapter called Love Poetry in the World. It gives you some sense of the way his mind works from what would seem like a very specific tradition to enlargement of that tradition. And I have to say, I love the title because unrequited love is quite familiar. But you wouldn't think a conqueror expects to be requited. But unrequited conquest gives you the sense of that and it's there powerfully in the book, that conquerors have desires also. So the first book was 1991, the second 1999. And quite recently, in 2013, he's written a remarkable book called 5 Words, Critical Semantics in the Age of Shakespeare and Cervantes. And one of the things that makes this book so intriguing is you'd never guess the words. They're really an extraordinary collection. And he discusses just about why he isn't writing about the words you'd expect him to be writing about. So the 5 words fall into sort of 3 categories. The first one is invention. You think, well, okay, we're in the world of Renaissance rhetoric. I'm there. Then language. Okay, that's sort of a leap, but we're still in the world of the verbal. But then resistance. So suddenly we're in a very different world of all sorts of things, including, of course, politics. And then, very surprisingly, blood. Not exactly the word you would have thought to go along with invention. And then we move, but we're still, of course, in the world of politics, and maybe resistance points us in some ways to blood. But then we move, and this is typical of Roland, to an even larger realm. The last of the words is world, a word that he's actually done a lot of thinking about. So to repeat myself, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Roland Greene, who is going to talk to us today and is going to use one of the words I've mentioned, How Poetry Remakes the World, Elegy and Epithalamion in Renaissance Poetics. So, welcome.
Thank you, Richard. It's an honor to be introduced at such length and in such detail, and most of all, it's an honor to be here with all of you in this series. This is a Renaissance talk, as Richard indicated. On different occasions, sometimes I talk about modern things, sometimes I talk about postmodern things, sometimes English language things, and sometimes other things. But when Richard invited me to speak in this series, I happened to have something that I thought would be of interest to this group on English Renaissance material, and so that's what I've chosen. I think the issues here would be interesting to people in other fields as well. So in the spirit of a series on the history and forms of lyric, I'll speak today about two challenges that intersect. How we might renew our understanding of the classicist poetics of the Renaissance lyric, and how we might revisit the genre criticism of the late 20th century. If early modern European poetry is conceived in a zone between the authoritative examples of classical verse represented by forms and genres such as the elegy and the epithalamion, and on the other hand, vernacular poetics as the site of expansive, often unscripted possibilities, then we're obliged to notice how that zone is redrawn over the course of the Renaissance as the classical genres, of which these two represent strikingly different instances, become absorbed into the practice of poetry in English. The premise of the present talk is that the adaptation of classical models into the vernacular entails a process of reinterpretation, which is masked by a common nomenclature. In one sense, elegy, epithalamion, and other terms inherited from antiquity, including ode, hymn, complaint, pastoral, epigram, and so forth, in one sense they are available irregularly from antiquity through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, but in the era of early modern humanism, each term, I argue, is not only the register of received meanings, but a field for the negotiation between past and present, especially where the reach of a genre has come to accommodate new circumstances. Sometimes, as in the case of elegy, the classical sense of a term is more capacious, while the Renaissance meaning becomes more closely held over time. In other cases, such as the epithalamion, the pre-modern and modern meanings are ostensibly the same, a poem celebrating a wedding, but Renaissance poets and readers tend to see a more complex problem that such a poem addresses. In a sense, this is to imagine that these stock genres are more than legacies of classical poetry adapted into English. It is to suppose that they participate in the social, ethical, and phenomenal questions of Renaissance thought. During this period, of course, theologians such as Martin Luther, historians such as Francesco Guicciardini, and philosophers such as Niccolo Machiavelli address, among many other topics, the nature of private experience, the pull of the invisible past on the present, and the removal between a deed and how it is received. In their own ways, these genres respond to these and other questions within the compass of poetic representation. As I've meditated on this challenge within Renaissance poetics, I've also been thinking about the long moment of genre criticism in this field that began in the late 1950s and continued until the late 1970s. A few titles of critical books will summon that era. Allegory, the Theory of a Symbolic Mode. The Earthly Paradise and the Renaissance Epic. Paradoxia Epidemica. The Metaphysical Mode from Dunn to Cowley. Protestant Poetics and the 17th Century Religious Lyric. And Inescapable Romance, Studies in the Poetics of a Mode. How genre became not just a fact, but a powerful paradigm seemingly all at once, provoked and enabled a spate of influential books and essays that still speak to us, generated a logic for the field, a way of thinking about literature that was very much of its time, but nonetheless still holds implications for what many of us do, and then retreated, as critical methods inevitably retreat in the face of a diminished explanatory power. All of these questions continue to interest me as a methodological counterpoint to my foregoing observations about the possibilities of classicist lyric. Above all, I've been wondering, where would a genre criticism for today obtain its power? And what might it tell us about the early modern kinds of lyric based on classical models? What I will attempt today is an approach located where these two challenges converge. I propose to revisit the classicist lyric of the Renaissance through a kind of experimental genre criticism based not on formalism imported from the 20th century, but on my own contrapuntal reading among the classical prescriptions for each genre, the assumptions embedded in Renaissance poetic treatises, and, of course, the poems themselves. The object of this approach is a criticism, not of forms, but of motives, namely the poet's drives to render a received genre in terms of what a few moments ago I called the social, ethical, and phenomenal questions of Renaissance thought. When I look across a genre throughout the period, I want to ask, what were the poets collectively doing to make something old new again? Many of these adaptations stage their contemporaneous relevance by investigating those questions that preoccupy the poetic theory of the time. They investigate gaps in the artist's capacity, or urgent questions about what poetry can do in the world, or obstacles to representation. Most of all, they hold a common interest in exploring how poetry remakes the world, not in antiquity, but in their own Renaissance present. This, then, is a provisional answer to two questions at once. Where did adaptations of classical poetry gain their connection to the exuberant, born vernacular poetry of the same era and their cultural force? And can we imagine a genre criticism for today? A criticism not of forms, but of motives might advance our understanding on both fronts together. And now I will move toward my two genres, elegy and epithalamion, as exemplary cases. One is expansive and hard to capture, while the other is almost too easy to define. Both persist over the period, both evolve. They are everywhere. And the canonical instances often discussed in scholarship, say John Milton's Lycidas or Edmund Spenser's Epithalamion, scarcely represent the variety and complexity of these genres. And of course, both genres experienced a livelihood in 20th century criticism, where several influential interpretations set an agenda for a great deal of later work, including what you are about to hear. From the ancient elegy of Theocritus, Callimachus, and Virgil, and especially the Roman elegy of Catullus and his successors, early modern poets adapt a capacious range of topics and approaches, including, but not limited to, laments or poems of mourning. However we construe the nature of its Greek instances, which are defined in the end by their use of Elegiac Meter, their embrace holds a great deal more than the stock motifs of honoring the dead and finding consolation after grief. They speak of love, war, history, pleasure, and much more. Roman elegy, more circumscribed in its reach as well as in the period of its composition, tends toward love in all of its complexities. When Renaissance poets read the Greek and Roman elegists, they saw a poetry of lamentation and love, but noticed a rich complement of ways of registering absence, including that of persons no longer present or living, as well as of ideas, relations, and values. Even when the speaker's lover is physically available in a love elegy, something else may yet be absent: self-understanding, a true commerce between the lovers, or a correspondence between mythological precedents and present reality. Renaissance elegy might be understood then, not in its restricted sense of a lament for the dead, but expansively, as a way of recovering things below the surface of present reality. When Renaissance poets adapted Catullus and especially Ovid, they recovered a broad mandate for the genre, to treat discursively those things that are nearly unthinkable in other amatory genres of the time. For example, not how it feels to be in love, in the fashion of a sonnet, but what we think about how it feels to be in love, and what we don't know about how it feels to be in love, what's below the surface. Once we recognize it on its own terms, Renaissance elegy becomes legible as a reinterpretation of its antecedents conditioned to its own age. Epithalamion offers a complementary approach to another task of Renaissance poetry, to fuse public events and private experience into an occasional poetics adapted to the courtly and ceremonial culture of the period. While the genre comes into the Renaissance as public poetry, in its adaptation to the vernacular, it acquires an interior, not in the fashion of later Romantic poetry, but in the peculiar way natural to the 16th century, when events and occasions were often explored for the relations between, we might say, insides and outsides. Such early modern poems, we will see, exist not so much to record the subjectivity of a speaker, but to show the private within the public, the motives inside the gesture, the affect behind the ceremony. A great deal of influential thought of the period is devoted to this kind of unmasking. Consider Castiglione's Book of the Courtier and Machiavelli's The Prince. And it makes sense that in the poetry as well, poets and readers expect to see genres such as the epithalamion, and perhaps we might say the same of the ode, reweighed in this inquisitive spirit. The early modern epithalamion can be construed as a wedding poem, much in the way that the contemporaneous elegy might seem to be a lament for the dead. But classically inflected poetry of this period, I suggest, is often motivated by problems of poetics that extend beyond the genre at hand. The instigation for the most searching epithalamia is to discern the difference between an act and an event, which translates to the difference between the act of marriage and the event of a wedding. Poems such as John Donne's Epithalamion or Marriage Song on the Lady Elizabeth and Count Palatine being married on St. Valentine's Day, and Robert Herrick's Epithalamy to Sir Thomas Southwell and his lady, locate themselves in the crease between these two kinds of occasion and deserve the epithet occasional, not for addressing a particular occasion, but because they do that, but for inquiring into the making of occasions in human life. In my remaining minutes then, I will consider the two genres, elegy and epithalamion, briefly through a few representative examples, trying to render legible those challenges and expedients by which they were reworked in English. In this setting, the classicism of Renaissance English poets is most profitably construed as their way of finding expressive but also explanatory power in the available genres of classical poetry. Each genre will be discussed briefly through one or two instances that demonstrate what I argue is the constitutive problem of that genre in the Renaissance. On the case of elegy, conjuring what is absent or latent, and in the case of epithalamion, rendering an act into an event. The poems under discussion, John Donne's Elegy on his mistress and Ben Jonson's Epithalamia on two marriages of 1608 and 1632, tend to demonstrate their genres in self-conscious fashion, serving as definitions and commentaries even while they seem to exist as discrete works of poetic art. They remind us that even the most authoritative literary terms represent compromises between past and present and develop new justifications as circumstances change, or do not develop those justifications and disappear with their original contexts. Of the Renaissance genres that show themselves as survivors across contexts, elegy is one of the hardiest. Classical elegy is a highly uneven terrain, including the laments of Archilochus, the frankly erotic lyrics of Gallus, Tibullus, Propertius, and Ovid, the pastoral laments of Theocritus and Virgil, and other topics that fall within the loose tissue of the genre. The basis of elegy is elegiac meter, which consists of a distich or couplet, one line of hexameter followed by a line of pentameter. Horace called these versibus impariter in iunctis, verses unequally joined, because of the instability built into the pairing, a rising line of 6 feet matched with a falling line of 5. While the couplets often resolve into units of sense, the asymmetry in the meter propels each couplet into the next, and the resulting poem is a vehicle for many kinds of seeking. In Elegy number 1.2, this is quid juvat ornato procedere, Propertius applies the meter to descry the perfection of the naked form within the adorned body. In translation, what avails it, my love, to step out with ornate hair and flutter the sheer folds of a Cohen dress, preventing your figure from displaying its own true merits? While Ovid in the Amores elevates the quotient of narrative to depict, within the story of a confounding love affair, many discrete events that involve the problem of attaining a fulfillment that is close at hand but in many ways unreachable. For example, a memorable passage, that husband of yours will attend the same banquet with us. May that dinner, I pray, be your husband's last. Must I then merely look upon the girl I love, be merely a fellow guest? While it finds many versions in classical poetry, this orientation of form and attitude becomes a central bequest from antiquity to the European vernaculars, especially English. Readers and writers of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance seem to understand that elegy is a kind of poetry in which metrical, psychic, and fictional elements converge around the problem of addressing something not present in or to the poem. Toward the end of the 17th century, of course, this problem is made regular in a particular generic disposition, elegy as lament for the dead. But for the preceding 2 or 3 centuries, early modern elegy can be that sort of lament, or many other things: praise for an unattainable model of conduct, flirtation with a woman who withholds body or mind, meditation on death as a human concern. The modern notion of elegy that has been so well anatomized by Peter Sachs, Jahan Ramazani, and other critics is not inapt for this era, but it does not tell the entire story of a set of conventions that struggles to define itself as a genre. John Skelton's Philip Sparrow is a curiosity in the history of English elegy, a founding instance from the very beginning of the 16th century that carries its own counterexample within it. The first section of the poem is over 800 lines of lament for the dead sparrow, Philip, in the voice of his mistress, Jane Scrope, closely following the office for the dead. Then follows this transitional remark. But for my sparrow's sake, yet as a woman may, my wit I shall essay an epitaph to write, in Latin, plain and light, whereof the elegy followeth by and by. Are the two literary terms, epitaph and elegy, used here as synonyms? Or does Skelton promise an epitaph whereof there will follow an elegy? I believe the latter reading comes closest to his meaning. He says that the elegy comes not immediately, but by and by, presumably as the epitaph winds down. The distinction seems to be between mere epitaph and something greater and of wider implications, perhaps not only a lament for the dead, but a reflection on an object that could not be possessed in any event, dead or alive. George Putnam, Renaissance poetician, addresses this criterion when he writes that, quote, an epitaph is but a kind of epigram only applied to the report of the dead person's estate and degree, or of his other good or bad parts, to his commendation or reproach. So as if it exceed the measure of an epigram, it is then, if the verse be correspondent, rather an elegy than an epitaph, unquote. Skelton implies that the epitaph and the elegy in part coincide, but in another part are disposed one following the other, or one picking up where the other leaves off. If he did not mark the boundary and apply the labels, would we know that we were watching epitaph shade into elegy? And in Putnam's terms, do we know where the measure of an epigram ends and elegy begins? I suggest that these appeals to objective measure and visceral distinction between the terms mask a supple sense of elegy that comes to define the terms for Renaissance poets and readers. If epitaph exists to honor what is gone, elegy comes into its own to celebrate what is not merely gone, but unavailable, hidden, or lost. And we see how an epitaph with a certain degree of ambition may become an elegy. This sense of the term explains the usages that confound the literary historian Morton Bloomfield, who rehearses the classical definition but then observes that in the Renaissance, quote, Latin elegies written in an artificial and reconstructed classical Latin flourished. The word in English, however, tended to be used primarily to indicate lamentation or, later, various mood poems. Elegy enjoyed an exuberant growth which has never been explained, except perhaps with general reference to the revival of the classics," unquote. Perhaps the explanation Bloomfield seeks is that in domesticating the programmatically unsettled quality of the classical elegy into English verse, poets such as Skelton see it as bringing classical authority to the project of disclosing what is not manifest or otherwise disturbing the surface of things, what he calls mood poems. What was a metrical criterion for classical elegy becomes something compound in English, a fusion of stance, tone, and mood. The unfixed form of English elegy allows the investigation of a topic to extend past the conventional bounds of a sonnet or any other stanza into new fields of discursive and even self-reflexive commentary. When Thomas Campion introduces his Book of Elegies, 1595, he acknowledges this aspect of elegiac writing. In translation, "Go far away, gloomy men, I warn you, go far off, stern men. Our page makes sport of serious judgments. Go, old men, unless by chance someone with sluggish marrow believes that there are flames in my songs. A more vigorous age, better suited to gentle sports, or a youth, or a clever girl should read me. And let the British celebrate by name the first poet, namely Campion, to sing sweet elegies and his own hidden acts in the original sua furta." Campion's appeal to a juvenescent, hot-blooded readership blends into the recognition that elegies gain their sweetness from disclosing what is hidden, the furta that cannot be spoken elsewhere with the same directness or charm. Despite Campion's self-designation as the first English elegist, the central event in the development of English Renaissance elegy is probably John Donne's set of poems of that genre. Written about 1593 to 96 when Dunn was a law student, these poems, which likely circulated as a book, include 13 to 20 poems about love. In form, they are made of rhymed couplets, varying in number from the 114 lines of The Bracelet to the 20 lines of His Picture. Dunn turns to elegy as a complement to his songs and sonnets, in which the experience of love is more often tangible and ripe for enjoyment. In the more philosophical and, of course, longer elegies, Dunn reflects on these elements of love that defy possession. Even the famous Elegy 19, Going to Bed, with its famous lines of erotic analogy, certainly the most often taught and the most often discussed lines in any Dunn elegy. "License my roving hands and let them go, before, behind, between, above, below. Oh, my America, my newfound land." Even those lines declare the joys of a hypothetical undressing to full nakedness. At the end of that elegy, we often forget, the speaker, the only one of the couple who is naked, is still cajoling the woman to disrobe. Perhaps the most famous bedroom scene in English verse is more a fantasy than a reality in its own fictional world. In other words, even an example of an elegy in which it would seem like something is concretely attainable, there is still something held back, something hidden. Now, Dunn's elegy on his mistress, which is on your handout, is an appeal to a lover to remain in England while the speaker goes abroad, but nonetheless to keep him in mind throughout his travels. From the first lines, however, the poem broaches a set of contexts that seem about to break out of that condition and become texts themselves. By our first strange and fatal interview, by that remorse which my words' masculine persuasive force begot in thee, by the memory of hurts which spies and rivals threatened me. Each of these clauses is a keyhole through which we see an entire history, and after 5 of them we reach the main clause of the sentence, I calmly beg. But no sooner does it appear than that main clause is overwritten by 2 more subordinate clauses, each one a condensed history followed by a new main clause, I conjure thee. Calmly beg what? Conjure thee to do what? Before completing the thoughts, the speaker revokes all the oaths to consistency he has sworn in the past so that he can overswear them again in the service of an exhortation not to accompany him on his journey. The poem captures a property of these lovers' mutual involvement that is named in the first line, strange and fatal. Fatal because, like their first encounter or interview, every conversation seems endowed with ultimate significance. There is no trivial talk between them. And strange because the poem talks around a fairly simple appeal with a dazzling array of condensed recollections, hypothetical statements, and vivid digressions that are more intriguing than its ostensible argument. Strange is the word that anchors the elegy from the first line that characterizes not only their first interview, but this conversation and probably every conversation as well. The speaker goes on to urge the woman not to disguise herself as a boy in order to accompany him as a page. And then at the exact midpoint of the lyric, line 28, he adds this injunction: "Be not strange to thyself only. All will spy in thy face a blushing, womanly, discovering grace." At the most literal level, "be not strange to thyself only" seems to say that her disguise will fool no one. But of course it implies more than that. Once the legibility of a woman poorly disguised as a man is thrown off, is the woman legible or illegible as herself? Is she strange or unstrange? Does being not strange to thyself only entail being strange to no one or being strange to everyone? The command at the center of the passage and the elegy, "Be not strange to thyself only," suggests that being strange to oneself and to everyone else is the baseline condition from which we ought not to decline. Once they are abroad in the elegy, questions such as these cannot be put back into any sort of fictional or formal box. They remain exposed to the light. The final episode in the elegy occurs after line 43, where the speaker winds into his final appeal. "Oh, stay here, for thee England is only a worthy gallery, to walk in expectation till from thence our greatest king call thee to his presence. When I am gone, dream me some happiness, nor let thy looks our long hid love confess, nor praise nor dispraise me, nor bless nor curse openly love's force, nor in bed fright thy nurse with midnight's startings, crying out, Oh, oh, nurse, my love is slain, I saw him go, o'er the white Alps alone, I saw him, I, assailed, fight, taken, stabbed, bleed, fall, and die." The power of this final passage is that it doesn't speak of their strange love in a strange world, but demonstrates that property in action. England is an apt stage for her desires because the passing show of persons who make themselves spectacles sets off not only her beauty, but her intellect. That is, she not only appears in the gallery, but observes it. All of this passing strangeness will dissolve only when God calls her to heaven and his presence, a translation from one reality to another, emphasized by the startling usage of a trochaic foot at the end of line 46, presence as a rhyme for thence. Nothing about God's presence rhymes with our world here below. The last injunction to the woman, "Don't frighten your nurse," with startings such as the curiously detailed raving that begins, "Oh, oh, nurse, oh, my love is slain," confirms that the project of the elegy's concluding phase is not to use the word strange, but to make us think it and say it, as if closing a semantic triptych. Our interviews as lovers are strange, our self-acquaintance as human beings is strange, and finally, accordingly, this poem and the world we see through it is strange. The speaker represents a property of their love, strangeness, that has implications for not only the course of love, but their self-understandings as human beings. And in addressing this highly mobile and transitive strangeness, he fashions a strange poem, bringing to light the property that he can otherwise only name. Compared to the compact love lyrics in the songs and sonnets and the socially and divinely directed poems of the satires and holy sonnets, elegies such as On His Mistress range discursively around a problem without resolving it, and deliver to the surface perspectives that might go unspoken in a different poem, that is, something shorter or with a stronger formal mandate or a higher measure of artifice. Pursuing that which is not present in or to the poem, Renaissance elegists claim for their genre a license to explore those furta that make reality as we recognize it. On a broad scale, this is a version of the capacity that in English poetry comes to be called wit. That is, the finding of resemblances and the development of extended metaphor, the disposition of paradoxes, and the absorption of new knowledge, all into a vividly rhetorical verse. Dunn's elegies, and early modern elegy in general, receive too little acknowledgement as a site of wit because the genre often opens issues without closing them, or exposes the incongruities between received learning and lived reality without quite telling us what to think about them. Philip Sidney glances at this property of elegy when he observes that the genre, quote, bewails the weakness of mankind and the wretchedness of the world, unquote. Sidney, who produces a few elegies, or eclogues, only within the confines of his fictional Arcadia, probably takes the view that elegy investigates too much and resolves too little, leaving the world more strange to us than a well-made poem should. But this too is wit, played out on a wide field and in the service of a more intellectually complex project than the briefer so-called metaphysical poems. Early modern poets make the elegy into a kind of poem that serves their interest in remaking, in this case we might say estranging and defamiliarizing their world. Compared to the often bewildering reach of the early modern elegy, the epithalamion might tempt us to imagine that it's too easily understood. While there are alternatives in Theocritus and Statius, the salient template for Renaissance epithalamia is a tradition of wedding songs derived from Catullus 61 and 64 by way of Sappho. Principal Renaissance examples include Neo-Latin epithalamia by Pontano, Ariosto, Buchanan, and others, experiments by Tasso and Marino, and Quevedo, and of course the widely imitated poems by Ronsard and Du Bellay. In an unsurpassed essay that belongs to that tradition of genre criticism I invoked earlier, Thomas M. Greene locates many of these examples against one another and describes the elements of the Sapphic Catullan convention, which attains its apex in English in, of course, Edmund Spenser's Epithalamion, 1595. The dispositive elements are that the poet-speaker should depict a web of social connections that renders legible where he stands in relation to the often aristocratic bride and groom. The poet should accept, I'm quoting Greene throughout this, should accept a stockpile of topoi, commonplaces, similes, and epithets, especially those that evoke leading precursors such as Catullus 61. The epithalamion implies a social context, an actual wedding with festivities appropriate to the setting, and must refer to a specific day, fictive or real. Thus, still Greene, the poem acquires dramatic impetus not from an institution, marriage, but from a series of concrete actions, a wedding. And finally, the poet-speaker enacts a role that straddles the wedding and the poem that represents it. As Greene shows, this latter element is largely a Catullan innovation that comes to define the genre for many of its Renaissance adapters. In Spenser's middle-class version, the poet-speaker sings of his own wedding, an unprecedented joining of roles. Noticeably and with considerable charm, all of the other elements shift in response to this condition. The received topoi come off differently in light of the poet's speaker's own wedding. The tributes to the bride's beauty need not suggest a strictly vicarious distance, and the typical gestures of welcome to the guests carry a current of anxiety within a general hospitality, exactly as if one were the host of a wedding and were charged with also writing the poem and welcoming the guests. The provision of a distinctive stanza form, 19 lines mostly of pentameter with 3 lines of trimeter and 1 final line of hexameter, and the publication of the poem alongside his sonnet sequence, the Amoretti, fulfill Spenser's domestication of the classical epithalamion in a vernacular setting. Now, implicit in Greene's anatomy of the genre is the summons that early modern poets tend to see in the genre, to explore the powers and devices that render an act, such as marriage, into an event like a wedding. The social motive for such a poem is to celebrate a wedding with the possibilities of social reconciliation that entails. But the poetic motive is to demonstrate the poem's capacity to locate itself in the gap between act and event, shaping the former into the latter. The distinction between an act and an event may seem abstract, but when the scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger turns to the epithalamion in his Poetics, much of his exposition is devoted to the rituals and gestures that bridge act and event. For instance, the strewing of nuts outside the bedroom that is mentioned in both Virgil's 8th Eclogue and in Catullus 61. When they cast nuts before the door of the bedroom, is this a practical expedient to muffle the sound of the bride's cries during intercourse? Or is it that, quote, because nuts protect their kernel, the casting of them provides a good omen of the parents sheltering their offspring with equal protection, unquote. The first explanation belongs to an act and makes only literal sense, while the second implies an event in which the central act enjoys a meaning beyond itself. Scaliger presents the two explanations alongside one another, but then proposes a third, that as children give up playing with nuts when they enter adulthood, the revelers throw nuts to mark the end of childhood. The version he prefers, in other words, fuses act and event by making literal and symbolic meaning out of a single gesture. Scaliger and many of his contemporaries posit an epithalamion that would explain the two kinds of occasion and accept for poetry the office of moving between them. When Putnam describes the classical epithalamion as a poem performed in 3 episodes during wedding festivities, his investment in what he calls the mystery of the whole matter seems connected not to the particulars of the genre, but to its role in disposing a social act into parts, veiling the physical rigors of the act with reflection on its meaning, and establishing moods for participants and spectators. This is the long prose passage on your handout. Probably I won't read the whole thing, but oh, what the hell, I'll read most of it. But notice, think about, as I read it, think about those properties of what he's describing that make, help you make the distinction between act and event. This epithalamy was divided by breaches into 3 parts to serve for 3 several fits or times to be sung. The first breach was sung at the first part of the night when the spouse and her husband were brought to their bed, and at the very chamber door, when in a large outer room used to be, beside the musicians, good store of ladies or gentlewomen of their kinfolk and others who came to honor the marriage. And the tunes of the songs were very loud and shrill, to the intent there might be no noise heard out of the bedchamber by the squeaking and outcry of the young damsel, feeling the first forces of her stiff and rigorous young man. The tenor of that part of the song was to congratulate the first acquaintance and meeting of the young couple, allowing of their parents good discretions in making the match, then afterward to sound cheerfully to the onset and first encounters of that amorous battle, to declare the comfort of children and increase of love by that means chiefly caused. The second part of the ballad was to refresh the faint and wearied bodies and spirits, and to animate new appetites with cheerful words, encouraging them to the recontinuance of the same entertainments, that they should persist in all good appetite with an invincible courage to the end. In the morning, the same musicians came again with this last part, and greeted them both with a psalm of new applausions, for that they had either of them so well behaved themselves that night, the husband to rob his spouse of her maidenhead and save her life, the bride so lustily to satisfy her husband's love and escape with so little danger of her person, for which good chance they should make a lovely truce and abstinence of that war till the next night, sealing the placard of that lovely league with 20 manner of sweet kisses, and then by good admonitions inform them to the frugal and thrifty life all the rest of their days. Putnam all but announces that the epithalamion, moving alongside the acts of the marriage as a kind of commentary, lend them importance. It's not just that the poet is an invited guest, as in Catullus, but that poetry itself is the factor that makes events. In this same spirit, Catherine Phillips begins her epithalamion to Lady Mary Butler on her marriage with Lord Cavendish with this quatrain that naturalizes poetic agency into part of a new whole, act and event fused together by what she calls concernment. At such a time as this, when all conclude nothing but unconcernment can be rude, the muses, madam, will not be denied to be the bridemaids where you are the bride. Phillips grants a name, concernment, to what only poets can do, but naturalizes it not merely as concern for the participants, but as what she calls concernment or implication in the wedding. Ordinary brides have normal bridesmaids, but only in the context of an epithalamion and the meaning that it grants to the event of the wedding do the muses themselves appear as bridemaids. More ambitious, Ben Jonson's epithalamion on the marriage of John Ramsay, Viscount Haddington, and Lady Elizabeth Ratcliffe revels in its capacity to show how state, in the sense of rank and the display associated with it is made necessary behind the curtain of ceremony by countless gestures of intimacy. This is on your handout. The solemn state of this one night were fit to last an age's light, but there are rites behind have less of state, but more of kind, love's wealthy crop of kisses and fruitful harvest of his mother's blisses. Only a poem of this sort, with its license to move across the curtain, confers the sight of the private domain transposed into the public by a code of reference known to a small circle of contemporaries. And only the epithalamion wrings ideality from these intimate acts while urging it on the reader, almost hectoring him here in the short lines of each stanza. And I've reproduced the short lines of the stanzas, in which the speaker is practically saying in so many words to the reader, you think you're watching one thing, look, you're really watching something else. See the ideality in the literal act that you're watching. Two of your troop that with the morn were free are now waged to Hymen's war, and what they are, if you'll perfection see, yourselves must be. And then again a few lines later, live what they are, and long perfection see, and such ours be. And finally, they sweeten Hymen's war, and in that jar make all that married be perfection see. 24 years later, Johnson's Epithalamion, celebrating the wedding of Jerome, son of Lord Treasurer Richard Weston, and Lady Frances Stuart, makes vivid the conventional link between the immediate occasion and the fate of humanity. It is the kindly season of the time, the month of youth, which calls all creatures forth to do their offices in nature's chime, and celebrate perfection at the worth, marriage, the end of life, that holy strife, and the allowed war, through which not only we, but all our species are. The consciousness of time is a necessary condition for turning an act into an event, of course, but it belongs to Johnson's special capacity in this kind of poem to do more, to open the most intimate reaches of experience to an awareness of their import. Till you behold a race to fill your hall, a Richard and a Jerome, by their names, upon a Thomas or a Francis call, a Kate, a Frank, to honor their granddames, and tween their grandsires' thighs, like pretty spies, peep forth a gem to see how each one plays his part of the large pedigree. And never may there want one of the stem to be a watchful servant for this state. This act of marriage becomes an event in its reference to a pattern of past acts, each one private in its own context, but altogether making a history inseparable from the state. Where but in a poem may our gaze move from the loins of the actors to the destiny of a family and a nation? From even in the acts of insemination and childbirth, fuse act and event as they happen. Before they are babies and children, the newborn infants emerge as gems, their worth already established by their place in a succession. And with Johnson's distinctive, breathless incoherence, they are also spies before they have anything to spy on or be spied on. A gem is a rock with a meaning and value. A spy is an observer with intent. And Johnson's two epithalamia are poems that not only entangle acts and events, but revel in their power to make the one into the other, and thus show us the world as we experience and interpret it. Many, if not most, early modern epithalamia address this potential with a tribute to celebrants and families that must seem inevitably like a declaration of poetry's power to intervene in this phenomenal, I'm almost tempted to say this, epistemological space. What would it mean, I ask in conclusion, to extend this kind of approach to other classical genres of the period, say the hymn, which offers up the challenge of representing sheer presence of God, of faith, of love, despite intellectual and cultural pressures that make such presence a problematic concept, or the ode, which addresses figures and occasions in view of the fit or the lack thereof between deeds and their significance. What would it mean to model a criticism of motives for the entirely vernacular lyric of the period, including the sonnet sequence? I leave it to you as readers and critics committed to the history and forms of lyric to imagine that those local readings and that kind of literary history based on the premises that poetry, by collating and dividing the terms by which we know the world, intends to remake it. In granting that motive, we also grant ourselves a warrant to envision forms and genres that are more than formalist and generic, and to recover the conversations around poetry that once made it inseparable from the most urgent questions of the age. Thank you.